Hello, Vox. When we admit that we have a need, when we admit that we thirst for something, something profound happens. It's not that our thirst is quenched, but relationship is created. Well, today we're exploring the fifth word from the cross of Jesus, I thirst. And once again, I've invited my friend Jon Bowles from Beggars Table, Church and Gallery, to come join me in a conversation about the fifth word from the cross. Enjoy the conversation.
You know, this is a funny thing, and I don't mean to sidetrack us, but I always think of the movie Ben-Hur when I think of the because there is, if you're familiar with that movie, earlier in the movie there's a scene where Charlton Heston is a slave and he collapses in the street,
Yes.
and then a man who turns out to be Jesus gives him water.
Yes.
And but what I loved about that movie ever since I was a kid is at the end when Jesus is carrying the cross and he collapses in the street, Charlton Heston runs to him and gives him water.
Yes.
And there's something profound about that I think this word speaks to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's read the scripture from which this story comes. It's in John 19, 28 to 29, and it goes like this. Later, knowing that everything had now been finished, and so that scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I thirst. A jar of wine vinegar was there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put the sponge on a stalk of hyssop plant, and lifted it to Jesus' lips.
Mm.
And one of the profound thoughts around this, which is maybe too profound for me today, is how to reconcile the divinity and humanity of Jesus in one thing. We tread on thin ice on this all the time. It's really hard to hold together that orthodox teaching that Jesus is fully God and fully human. And that means although there are times when we'll say cheeky things like, oh, that's his humanity showing.
Right.
The fact is Jesus is never not God, which has some implications in this conversation. A God who thirsts. And of course, this isn't really just a conversation about Jesus' death or Jesus' thirst. It's about our death too.
Right.
And the invitation, of course, in Lent, as we always talk about, is to take up some practices that irritate us, that put us in touch with the death experience so that we can die before we die.
Yeah. I really think, of course, I say this quite often at Beggars Table, but I really think one of the misnomers of Christianity, as popularly practiced, is that Jesus died on the cross so you don't have to. That's a message that we might mistakenly say, or something that we've maybe grown up hearing. But I think the truth is that Jesus died on the cross so that we can too, so that we can join him on the cross and in death. And speaking of Easter, because this is Lent, which is leading up to Easter, I think one of the misnomers of Easter is that the resurrection is simply about going to heaven or having immortal life. Where really, I think, and we can press into this later, but I think the message of Easter is about transformation, is that our ability to live a transformed life. And of course, what we have in the cross is that we don't experience transformation until we go through what Jesus is going through on the cross, which means this utter suffering and despair and I thirst. I was reading, Richard Rohr, of course, says transformation really only comes to us through two ways, and that's love and suffering. But then he goes on to say, at the end of the day, suffering always wins.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, when we really love something, then we suffer for it. And you don't realize that until you love something. But when you attach yourself to, whether it's a spouse or a good friend or your children or a baseball team, right? You love it, that means that you suffer.
Yes, that's right.
And I love what Richard Rohr said, because he said, when we're young, we don't think that applies to us. We think that we can avoid that. We think that we can love anything in depth, and over the long term will be okay.
Yeah.
But in actuality, over the long term, we learn that we all suffer.
Yeah.
We all join Jesus on the cross.
Well, and the cross then becomes this powerful metaphor for this. because the cross is this thing that has the power, because it's a death experience, to separate us from those things that we think we can't live without.
Right.
Right. That's why we suffer so much in love, right? Because of our need to sustain and to get every life. I mean, I resisted for years getting a pet because in my imagination, I already know what's coming.
It's a great example of what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To love is to suffer. So I don't even know if you can draw such a fine line between the two things. The cross, though, then becomes, for Christians, this great metaphor for this experience, this instrument of death, the cross, that separates us from, as we've been talking about, the false self, those things in which we find our security, significance, and love apart from God.
Right.
Well, the cross is going to break those things down. Of course, for Jesus, though, he, by all accounts, is a guy who never got any of that twisted. I don't know what you think of that, but it seems like Jesus lives his whole life with this sense of identity that's rooted in his relationship to the Father, and not in these other
I think that's one of the most profound things of Jesus, is his security in his identity that we find. Well,
one of the hallmarks, I think, of the false self that presses against this word from the cross, that resists it, this word is about admitting need. But one of the hallmarks of the false self is this posture that we don't have any needs, or I don't have any needs that cannot be met within myself. In other words, I like you, all right, John.
Right.
But I don't really need you.
You don't want to need me.
No.
Yeah.
I don't need anything.
I don't want you to need me.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We're both protecting some things. And I think that's part of the reason why when we see Jesus suffering on the cross, for me, it makes me a little uncomfortable.
Totally.
It certainly had to make his followers uncomfortable at the time. His detractors certainly were aware of the difference between what a conquering, powerful king looked like and this image that Jesus was walking around portraying, let alone what he was portraying by the time he got to the cross, an image of weakness.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that this word makes me really uncomfortable because of just what you said. It's verbalizing weakness. There's a loss of control, and I don't want the Jesus I believe in to show any weakness.
No.
And that's something that I think that we don't talk about enough and reconcile.
Yeah.
Is what role does weakness have in our journey as Christ followers, and where does it fit in with our attempts to have influence and power?
Yeah.
So I'm always drawn to the passage in 2 Corinthians. This is 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul says, "My grace is sufficient for you. Yeah. For my power is made perfect in weakness," which is a crazy thing to say.
Yeah.
And he goes on to confirm that by saying, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." And when I read that, I hear power and weakness being held up together, not on opposite ends of the spectrum, but together. Like there's something that they intertwine with each other. And that's a crazy thing to actually sit with.
It is, and yet it seems to find a home with all of the other paradoxes that we have to get used to in our faith. I think of Jesus himself constantly taught like this: if you want to find your life, you have to lose it, or whoever wants to be first has to be last. And here, God's power is not something other than weakness. Well, if we're going to talk about weakness, I think that one of the dark forces that I think falls across us as a shadow of death has a name, and the word is shame. Right. Shame is this force that calls out our weakness, it shines a light on it, it exposes us. That's why shame is such a bad feeling. You had a good definition of shame. Yeah. Do you remember?
Yeah, well, I have it written down here for us. What I can't remember where I got this, but I think this is great. The dissonance between the image that we're trying to project. So the thing is, most of the time we want to project ourselves as people of power. I'm a person of power. I'm a person of influence. I'm a person who's in control. So
self-sufficient.
Right. It's what we're calling the false self. But so that image that we're projecting, the dissonance between that and who we really are, that's where shame is.
Okay.
So when who we really are gets exposed, we feel this sense of shame. And I actually thought, just to be relatable, it would be fun to share a story. And you've got a story. We could share stories about this.
I do. Let me get this straight first.
Okay.
Shame is the dissonance. I like that word because I'm a
dissonance.
musician, and so you could say distance if you're
Right.
into that. But I like dissonance. It's the dissonance between that false self we try to project and who we really are.
Right.
I like that. Well, the story that immediately came to mind for me was when I think we're probably all at our most compulsive about false self, which is, in college.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how most of these stories go back to when we're in our early 20s.
Some of the most powerful, shameful moments, right?
Because we haven't learned yet.
No. We still think that the false self is sustainable at that point.
Sure.
This is a safe example, but...
Okay. I'll tell you what, I'll share an unsafe example.
Okay, I'll leave that to you. Well, when I was in college, I was studying guitar, classical guitar, and I had a classical guitar teacher I just loved. I still do. I just totally admired the guy, wanted to be like him, wanted to be his favorite student. I wanted to show up every week having him think, this is my best student. And I wanted to think that about myself. And so I wanted him to know I practiced every day. I had that week's lesson nailed, that I just lived and breathed guitar. And so when I would show up on a week where that wasn't true, and then I got this glimmer, this glimpse that you can just feel between people where it's like, I know I haven't practiced like I was supposed to, and now I think that you think that I haven't practiced. And then in that moment, guess what I'm feeling? Shame. Yeah. That's a bad feeling.
Yeah.
I was letting this image down of what I was trying to uphold.
Yeah. It's a real relatable example because I think that most of us have been there where I want to look this way and in reality I've been this way, and we feel that shame. So I get to share a story and this will just be between us again. But at the church I used to work at before Beggars Table, so it was years and years ago, and it was a big church. I was one of 6 pastors who were there, but I was preaching every Sunday, and I was preaching in a way that was not like how I preach today. In other words, I was really confident, and I preached with a lot of certainty, and it was a lot of Bible teaching that was telling people this is what the Bible says, this is what God thinks, and bam, 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 very black and white, and it was incredibly popular. I was
assuming that you had a larger crowd.
Yeah, it was very attractive to people, one day, and you have to remember, I was in my early 20s, and I'm just going to refer to that, not to be offensive to anyone who's in their early 20s, but from where I stand now, I was a kid. I hadn't lived much of life. I was very young to be telling everyone what God says, like black and white. But again, it's attractive. People love the idea that someone has answers, and so a lady... She was probably about 30 years old, so at my age, she was an older woman. Now she'd be very young to me, but she came to my office at that church to seek my counsel, and she wanted to know what the Bible said about her situation. And her situation was that she was in the middle of an affair with a married man, and she was totally torn about it and heartbroken, and she broke down into tears. And I wasn't used to people being this vulnerable with me or coming to me with these kinds of problems. Before this, I had just been on Young Life staff working with high school kids. Yeah. This was brand new to me, and I felt scared. And I also knew that I had posed as a Bible answer man. And she was coming to me for Bible answers. Yeah. And I stuttered and stumbled, and I flipped through the Bible some, and I read a few verses here and there, and I just knew that I was not doing any good. I had not scratched the itch at all, and she left, and she was not, I don't think she had been ministered to at all. I think I had been exposed, and I felt a sense of shame. And to make matters worse, Rustin, when I saw her the following Sunday at church, I couldn't remember her name. I think I called her the wrong name, which is, you just don't do that.
No.
And between her and me, I don't know if anyone else knew, but she realized who I was. At this young 20s kid who was spouting off so much from the pulpit and didn't really know. And yeah, there's a deep sense of shame there. That was a dissonance.
I don't know why I'm laughing.
It's funny.
I used to work for a pastor who would call that kind of laughter, gallows humor. Whenever we were walking into a really tough meeting, and we would crack jokes, and
you had gallows humor,
only because it's so painful to admit how.
Well, it's been years and years now, but she's not at my church,
and you haven't made any mistakes like that recently, so no.
Oh, the list goes on. The dissonance is always there. Yeah.
Well, we're laughing, but the truth is, shame is a shadow of death. Mm-hmm. And it certainly feels that way. It's a feeling that who we are, or who we want to believe that we are, is under attack. And where does that come from? False self. Mm-hmm. It's that false image that creates the dissonance. The true self doesn't have a need to project an image.
Right.
And because ultimately, I'm not less loved or less worthy or valuable because I didn't practice every day that week. Mm-hmm. You weren't less loved because you didn't have an answer for actually a situation that doesn't have easy answers.
Ultimately, I wasn't less loved because I didn't know the Bible like I thought I did or wanted people to think I did.
That's right.
Yeah.
The true self knows that. And that's why Jesus is fascinating. He lived that way in every situation. I wrote down four things, four times where death, in its war against Jesus, employs the shame tactic against Jesus. And we get to see Jesus model a different kind of response. The first one that came to mind was the great Lenten passage, Jesus being tested in the desert. And the devil comes to him with really what you can read as shame-triggering statements. If you truly are who you say you are, then do these three things. But Jesus stands firm in his true self, knowing that he is the beloved of the Father, which was just affirmed at his baptism before that. A second occasion is when I think it's Peter who actually is shaming Jesus for Jesus is embracing this pathway of weakness, saying, I'm going to go to the cross and suffer. And Peter says, surely, there's a shameful word, surely Jesus. You won't suffer and die. And Jesus rebukes him. Get behind me, Satan. He doesn't think Peter's Satan. He recognizes the influence behind shame, which is that accuser, Satan. A third time was Pontius Pilate. During the trial of Jesus, Pilate, he's this Roman soldier. He cannot understand weakness as having any value. And he's practically, I think, begging Jesus to recant so he can set him free. To which Jesus has no need to cooperate with that falseness, and he just stays silent. And then the fourth time is before this moment of the cross. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Jesus is on the cross, and one of the criminals being crucified with him tries to shame him. If you are the Son of God. He's appealing to identity again, right? Yeah. And of course, Jesus knows who he is. He knows he's the Son of God, and that the Son of God is not the same image that everybody else has in their mind. It's shame over and over and over, the attempt to shame and set Jesus off course. And I think that happens to us constantly.
It does. And as you were talking, Rustin, I couldn't help but hear, because a lot of the statements, the scripture that you read was that if you do this, then do this. And when I hear that, it reminds me of kind of the either or culture that we're a part of, that dualistic culture that you're either this or this. And I find, because as a pastor, and I know this is true of you too, I'm trying to not go to either extreme. Like, I'm trying not to be an either or pastor, and I'm trying to lead a church that lives and will embrace the tension of the middle. And when I look at Jesus' life, I see him faced with the same kind of thing, either or. Well, the law says to do this, but you say to do this, so where do you stand? Pick a side. And Jesus is continually refusing to pick sides. He's like, I'm not going to play your game. I'm not going to live that dualistic life. I'm going to I'm going to hold the tension in the middle. And of course, what Jesus found out is the same thing that I think you and I find out and our churches find out, is that is so not a popular place to be. It's a hard place to be because people feel comforted and they feel reassured when we say, I'm all in over here, and we're drawing the line in the sand. Yeah. And so I think that shame tends to threaten us when we walk the path of Jesus and say, I'm not going to do your either or.
That's
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think living from the true self is one of the things it means is that we're already enough as we are, and we don't need to be included in any particular tribe in order to feel secure, significant, or loved.
Right.
It's okay to stand alone.
Yeah, that's well said.
That's what Jesus did. The true self is like that. It's secure in knowing that nothing that we do, nothing that we bring to the table makes us any more loved or any less loved. That, it turns out, is where real power is.
Right.
Because then there's no shame anymore. If you're free from shame, then you truly are powerful. It means practically, I think, the ability to admit our thirst, the ability to make peace with being resistant to shame, means to be able to say things like we've alluded to in our conversations already, I believe, and I still have doubts. Or I'm a Christian, and I'm still unfulfilled. Or I'm a pastor who gets paid to have faith, and I still feel discouraged sometimes.
Yeah.
Or I'm the Son of God, and I thirst.
Right.
Right. It just destroys the power of shame, because there's no shame anymore. There's no dissonance now between the image sometimes projected for us, and who we really are.
That's a great description of who our true self really is. Yeah. Our true self can hold that dissonance.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's one thing that gets exposed in this is shame, in this word from the cross. The second thing that I think is worth saying, I guess we've kind of alluded to it already, it's this word, I thirst, that when we say it, in whatever form that is, when we say, here's how I really am, we admit that we have a need that we cannot fulfill, and we need support from outside ourselves. And so Jesus in this word is not, as you said, is not just proclaiming a need, but he's saying, I'm asking for help from someone else, from you.
Yeah.
That to me is a contrast between the true and false self. It takes us back to that discomfort with being something other than self-sufficient. It takes us back into this conversation of, I like you, but make no mistake.
Yeah.
I can get by without you.
Yeah. And if there's anyone we want to say that, it's Jesus. Isn't that the Jesus we believe in?
Yeah.
Of course we need him, but the idea that he would need us?
Yeah. Yeah, or that he has any needs that he cannot satisfy within himself.
Right.
I'm not totally comfortable with that idea. I mean, I, like everybody else, want a Jesus. I want to defend his honor almost. Yeah. Like it's an honor thing for him to say, well, if he really wanted to, he could get himself a drink. He can do whatever. He's just doing that for us.
Don't you feel like we're being heretical?
It does.
It feels like that.
Yeah, because we think weakness is something to be shunned.
Yeah.
We don't see it as God's power.
Right. Exactly. We have not understood that.
No.
I would add this to that point is that, us evangelicals, we like to talk a lot about our relationship with God and our relationship with Jesus. So I was ushered into the faith with that kind of language, that you can have a personal relationship with Jesus. And there's nothing wrong with that language per se. No, it's strong language.
Yeah. I would say it's true as far as it goes.
Yeah. But if you break it down and you really think about it, what kind of relationship is it when only one person has needs? What kind of relationship do you really have if it's just you give and I receive?
Yeah.
What we have here is a picture of a Jesus who needs us to give and receive from us as well, which again is just, it sounds weird to say, and I certainly wouldn't say it so anyone else besides you and me could hear, but but yet that is the context of real relationship, and I think there's something there that we need to grapple with.
Yeah, it is the giving and receiving.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost as if God, in his weakness, it's in God's weakness that makes a space for us to relate to God.
Right.